is Lee White. He is a park ranger at the Chickamauga Park and has spoken to us before. The subject will be on Bushrod Johnson, and I'll let Lee tell himself a little bit about himself.
Well, I keep it fairly simple. Native of North Georgia, born on Chickamauga battlefield, sometimes I say, because I was born in Tri-County, which is now Hutchinson, and whatever it is now with Erlanger, so actually a part of the battlefield. So never thought I'd work at the battlefield, but luck happened stance about 12 years ago, and I ended up there. But anyway, what I'm going to speak about tonight is about some of the unsung Tennesseans, sort of the Battle of Chickamauga. We always get a focus on Frank Cheatham and his All-Tennessee division there, but we're going to deal with Bushrod Johnson and A.P. Stewart's divisions here now. At the reunion, I spoke a little more lengthy about Bushrod Johnson and didn't speak so much about A.P. Stewart. Well, this time I'm going to speak more about A.P. Stewart and a little bit about Bushrod Johnson. So if y'all were at the reunion, it won't be the same presentation that I gave there. But first of all, right now, 150 years ago, along the foothills of the Cumberland Plateau, the Army of Tennessee was engaged against the Union Army of the Cumberland in what was known as the Tullahoma Campaign. Kind of the unsung campaign this week, because as was mentioned earlier, we're about a week from now will be the 150th anniversary of that battle outside of that small south central Pennsylvania college town that will get way too much press over the next few weeks. But also befell, this was also the last days of the brave garrison of Vicksburg, Mississippi, as their supply lines had been cut and the supplies were dwindling down. And so that was also going on, but then there was the Tullahoma campaign. Well, in the Tullahoma campaign, 150 years ago, yesterday, a new division in the Army of Tennessee made its debut. That was the division of General Alexander Peter Stewart, known as the Little Giant Division, consisting of 4 brigades that never had served together before, but were now put together. The brigades of Bushrod Russ Johnson, an All-Tennessee brigade, a veteran brigade that had served in the Army of Tennessee for over a year, having fought at Perryville, Kentucky, the Battle of Murfreesboro, and now in the spring of '63 were put in with General Stewart. Then the other division of General John Calvin Brown. Now these guys were also veteran troops, but had a bit of bad luck. Brown's brigade had come to existence in the late summer of 1861, then found themselves as part of the garrison of Fort Donelson, Tennessee. Now that didn't end too well for them or for General Brown, who then was Colonel Brown of the 3rd Tennessee Infantry. And after the exchange, Colonel Brown becomes General Brown, and he gets command of this brigade, and he'll command them at the Battle of Murfreesboro, where they still kind of shaky, having spent that time in the northern prison camps. They're just not, there's a little bit of uncertainty about them, and also you can just imagine in their minds, having served time up there in one of those prison camps, they weren't too eager to be revisiting one of those places. The other brigade that he has is the brigade of the command of Brigadier General Henry Dallamar Clayton. Clayton was a pre-war lawyer in Barbara County, Alabama before the war, being a law partner with William Lowndes Yancey, one of the founders of the strong secession movement that eventually leads to the secession of the southern states. Clayton's brigade is made up of 3 Alabama regiments, of which only one has ever seen combat before, the 18th Alabama. They had fought at Shiloh. But then they got sent to Mobile, Alabama, hadn't seen combat since. So they're pretty rusty, and they're grouped with 2 Alabama units, 36th Alabama, 38th Alabama, which had never seen combat before. So pretty green group. So you kind of see an interesting picture popping up here. Johnson's brigade is the veteran brigade. You got Brown's brigade, which has some combat experience, but they're also guys that served time in the northern prisoner of war camp, and they're kind of shaky. Then you got the green as grass Alabamians. Then you got the other brigade, the brigade of Brigadier General William Brimage Bate. Fighting Billy, as he was known. Bate, a pre-war lawyer from Gallatin, Tennessee, who was also a very prominent newspaper editor, had served in the war with Mexico, and then been a Tennessee state congressman before the war. So he comes in with some pretty, big laurels around his shoulders. Very strong proponent of secession. He had enlisted as a private and then quickly found his way to being promoted to colonel, wounded at Shiloh, then he becomes a brigadier general, and now he gets his brigade. Now his brigade's a mismatch. Several Tennessee regiments, a couple of Georgia regiments, and one Alabama regiment, all grouped together. All 5 of his regiments, though, have had combat experience. Probably some of the toughest fighters in the division, and if not the whole Confederate Army, are in Bates' brigade. So these 4 brigades will be formed up, put into as Stewart's division. And 150 years ago yesterday, 2 of those brigades, Bushrod Johnson's brigade and William Bates' brigade, will fight against Colonel John T. Wilder's Blue Lightning Brigade at the Battle of Hoover's Gap. Probably a battlefield that most of y'all have been through, if you knew it or not. If you drive up Highway 24 going to Nashville, you're going to go right through the battlefield of Hoover's Gap, because Highway 24 plows right through the center of it. And so, anyway, 150 years ago, they were engaged in a battle at that location. And then the great withdrawal begins over the Cumberland Mountains, and then into Chattanooga, arriving in Chattanooga the first week of July in 1863. So some big momentous events as the war finally rolls in full force toward Chattanooga at this time. But Stewart's division is part of this. Stewart's division will be involved in the following campaign that will lead them to the Battle of Chickamauga on September 18th, 1863. Stewart's division will play a prominent role in all this. And before we go any further, just a little bit of an introduction about Alexander P. Stewart. He's probably a man I consider to be one of the best division commanders, best generals the Army of Tennessee has, but he doesn't get the flair of Bedford Forrest or Pat Claiborne or any of the others. Not to take anything away from these men, but A.P. Stewart was a very reserved man. He didn't have a lot, he wasn't really flashy, didn't ever really do anything truly stellar, but then again, he never messed up. He was a solid guy that ironically will be one of the last commanders of what was truly the Army of Tennessee. He was slow and methodical, and he even earned him the nickname of being called Old Straight. Gives a little bit of a background though on A.P. Stewart. Stewart was born in 1821 in Rogersville, Tennessee. He managed to land an appointment to West Point, graduating in the class of 1842, but only served a few years in the Army before he resigns to go become an educator. And just before the war, he is the chair of the Department of Mathematics and Philosophy. So think about the type of personality that would go along with that combination. And now you can figure out why he's called Old Straight as well. Supposedly it was because of his ramrod straight posture, but I think it also was a reflection of his impeccable character. Stewart will be described almost a little over 150 years ago in the Chattanooga Daily Rebel. The newspaper describes him as having the essential qualities for a commanding officer: coolness and skill coupled with a thorough acquaintance of the art's military air. A firm disciplinarian, but with thorough, even temper that never suffers itself to be exerted or betrayed into any rash or intemperate expression. Always the same calm, unmoved demeanor. And if you think about that, that's the perfect type of person you want commanding on a battlefield, because he's not going to get overly excited, he's not going to panic, and then again, he's also not going to get his dander up and rush off and to do something crazy. So he's a very good military officer and a good steady one. Now, this is also proof forth within the Army in that A.P. Stewart is kind of in the middle of the politics of the Army. He seems to always remain in the middle of everything. That he stays on good terms with Braxton Bragg, but also with Leonidas Polk as well. Both generals will write very complimentary of Stewart. And if you know anything about Leonidas Polk and Braxton Bragg, it's hard to believe that they would have anything in common, but the one thing they do have in common is their admiration for A.P. Stewart. So that when the Battle of Chickamauga is being planned, when Braxton Bragg is getting everything ready to go into action, Stewart is going to play a big role in this. His plan on September 18th was for a three-pronged movement to get around the Union Army, which was concentrated at Lee and Gordon's Mill. Basically to move around through the woods to the north, cut the Yankees' route into Chattanooga, and then launch a smashing attack on them out of the forest at Lee and Gordon's Mill. And he picked 3 generals to command these forces. And Stewart will play one of the roles in all of this. And this also, another one of the generals will be Bushrod Johnson, formerly brigade commander in Stewart's division. But when they got right about the time, a week or so before Chickamauga, Bushrod Rush Johnson found himself at the right place at the right time. He was at Ringgold, Georgia. Reinforcements are arriving for the Army of Tennessee from Mississippi at that point. 2 brigades got there. Campaign's moving. They don't want to wait for the rest of them, so they throw them together with Johnson. Presto, he's got his own division now. So he goes from being a brigade commander in Stewart's division now to having his own. So leaving Stewart now with just three brigades. So when they move into action on September 18th, Bushrod Johnson will move his division out from Ringgold and clash with Union cavalry approaching Reed's Bridge and force them in. Then Stewart will be ordered to cross the Chickamauga Creek at Thedford's Ford, a few miles further south. But when they hear all the gunfire going on from the fighting with Johnson and then with fighting at Alexander's Bridge, they are kind of take their time and don't rush off into anything. Again, playing up on Stewart's personality of not jumping off into anything and not being rash. But just to give a flavor for this, they also come under artillery fire. And just to give an example of this, one shot actually struck near Stewart and actually ricocheted over him and over some of the troops behind him, but he remained unmoved and unfazed. So again, showing that level of calm that was part of his personalities, while other shells continued to explode around his command and among some of the other men in his division. But Bushrod Johnson's advance will take Reed's Bridge, but it's nearly sunset on the 18th, too late to go into Bragg's plan to smash into the Union flank at Lee and Gordon's Mill. Stewart's men just only make a foothold onto the other side of Chickamauga Creek before it's dusk, and they don't go any further as well. So things are going to lay over to the next morning. And of course, the Battle of Chickamauga will kick into full gear on the morning of September 19th as Bedford Forrest and his cavalry run into the lead elements of the Union Army near Jay's Mill on the north side of the Chickamauga battlefield, and fighting starts. And then it's just this bloody game of tic-tac-toe as one side brings up reinforcements, the other side does, back and forth, back and forth. Well, all this is going on. Bushrod Johnson's new division and A.P. Stewart's division are sitting down near the Chickamauga Creek, formed up, ready to launch that attack against the Union forces at Lee and Gordon's Mill, but they never get the orders to go forward because of this fighting going on to the north. Neither side expected it, and Bragg doesn't really know what to make of it. You know, he still has these guys, he doesn't want to commit them to this because he still wants to launch that attack. But he just has to wait. And as things go on, more and more troops are funneled into the fighting, and it just grows and grows. The soldiers, in fact, I've read a letter before of a soldier in 37th Georgia, part of Bates' brigade, saying that he's writing out this letter and he's listening to the battle growing steadily closer and closer and closer as the fighting made its way south. Finally, late in the afternoon, General Stewart was sitting around with his staff smoking a pipe when a staff officer, Major Pollock Lee, from Bragg's staff, arrives and gives him orders to move to the point where the firing had commenced, which seemed to be a considerable distance to the right and somewhat to the rear of us, recalled one of Stewart's staff. So Stewart's not too clear on that order. I mean, the order simply states, basically go to where you hear the gunfire. Well, got several thousand soldiers fighting, where exactly is the gun firing at? So Stuart rides back to Bragg and asks a little more clarity, some more specifics about this order. And Bragg tells him that Walker had engaged on the right and was much cut up, and that the enemy threatening to turn his flank, that General Polk was in command on that wing, and I must be governed by circumstances. So now he's been told to go where the gun firing is the heaviest. Now you must be governed by circumstances. Still not the clearest picture in the world for Stuart, but now he realizes he's going to have to do what the boss has told him. He forms his men up, and they begin marching northward toward the sound of the guns. As they move through the forest, the men are ordered to move into double quick, a jog, trying to keep racing closer and closer to the gunfire when they burst into an open field. This is the Brock Field, almost squarely in the middle of the Chickamauga battlefield. And just as Stuart and his staff come into the field, they're met by a staff officer from General Polk's staff, Lieutenant William Richmond, who tells him from what he arrived and told Stuart from what he knew of the nature of the ground and the situation of the enemy, a better point of which to attack them could not be found. Indeed, he had arrived just at the nick of time. General Frank Cheatham's division had went into action just about an hour before. A very powerful unit in the Army. Stuart's division had advanced, become engaged, driving back Union troops, trying to turn their flank, when they in turn were struck on their flank. Again, that tic-tac-toe thing I was mentioning earlier. One division moves in, another pushes them back, then they get pushed back. Well, that's what had happened. But the very flank they had turned had resulted in the capture of William Carnes's Tennessee battery, and now was routing the brigade of Wright's brigade of Cheatham's division. So men are starting to stream out of the woods, and this is the scene that Stuart's asked to go into. Stuart will react quickly and form his division of 3 brigades into a column of brigades, with Henry Clayton's brigade in front, John Brown's brigade next, and then third will be William Bates' brigade. So you got Clayton, Brown, Bate. And he orders Clayton in. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting. Clayton, the greenest guys in the bunch, are the first group sent into action. And they're a massive brigade. They're moving forward through the woods, not knowing where the Union troops are, and they stumble into the Union line. A lieutenant in the 38th Alabama noted, "We found our brethren who preceded us in the fight in much confusion and considerable panic. The woods, it was all woods, was full of stragglers and skulkers and wounded. Whole companies, regiments, and brigades seemed to be scattered to the winds. Officers, even their tinsel on them, seemed to be hunting a safe place in the rear. The fugitives told the wildest tales of flight and massacre of regiments and brigades cut all to pieces." So here's these green guys, never been in combat before, and here are these guys coming back. Basically, it's hopeless. You know, they're all being destroyed. Our whole commanders, can you imagine what had to be running through those guys' minds having never been in combat before? The scene was disgraceful to our army, and at one time I thought that the battle lost, for it seemed that everybody had run or was running from the enemy. Worst of all, we were in the woods of a dense undergrowth and could not see the enemy 100 yards off. We only knew of their presence and position by the sound of their guns, and this only when fired. A danger that can be seen frightens less than one that is invisible. Fancy and fear created phantoms more terrible than any reality. But the Alabamians keep going forward until they smash into the Union line, and then a firefight begins. But again, these guys have never been in combat before, and in the eyes of one of General Stuart's staff officers, young 18-year-old Bromfield Ridley, he says, "Did you note the thickness of raindrops in a tempest? Did you ever see the destruction of hailstones to the growing cornfields? Did you ever witness driftwood in a squall? Such was the havoc upon Clayton. So just an idea, a very descriptive view of what that first engagement was for these Alabamians. Lieutenant Posey, who was quoted just a moment ago, then notes that the first volley they received is destructive. The first killed Major Jewett, Captain William Welsh, and brought down a score of companies of Welsh and Busey. The regiment then fronted itself by impulse without undoubling, and stood in many places 4 ranks, which soon increased to 5, 6, or 7. And as there was a scramble to the rear rank, this was natural and unavoidable under the circumstances. Again, the drill that they were supposed to fight in with the 2 ranks, in the panic of their first engagement, they're just jumbling all up into this basically this mob out there in the woods. They were fighting an unseen enemy. The truth is that no regiment stands firmly, fights coolly, without disorder in their first encounter. The entire line was under fire, and soon a scene of dire confusion ensued. The men kept up a wild fusillade, though they did not see the enemy. But they keep pouring the fire into the woods toward where they think the Union troops are. And the officer casualties just begun to mount in a staggering example. The 18th Alabama, their Colonel James T. Holtzclaw, who the name may sound familiar, was thrown from his horse and injured, passing command of the regiment to Lieutenant Colonel Richard Ng, who pressed the command forward. One soldier in the 18th noted, standing in a line and firing began seemingly without any command, and in 3 minutes the engagement was something awful. The slaughter was dreadful. We discovered we were within perhaps 50 paces of the enemy's line. Company G had 15 men wounded in less that many minutes. Lieutenant Colonel Ng was shot and fell from his horse. So Colonel Holtzclaw's wounded, now the Lieutenant Colonel Ng's wounded, and now command of the regiment passes to their Major Hundley. Clayton finally, because of this thing, orders the men to lay down onto the ground and began to try to fire. So not exposing themselves, but also trying so that they might could see under the smoke toward the Union lines. And they began to open a firefight then, firing into the Union lines. And this will keep up for some time until Clayton decides he's ready to try to push forward. He orders the men to fix their bayonets and to charge, but then he's told that the men have expended all their ammunition. At the same time, General Stewart had been not too far behind watching all of this. So because these men were so green, he was going to keep a close personal eye on them. And now that he saw that they had done their best, he's going to order them to rise up and fall back. At the same time, he sent orders to Brown to bring up his brigade. So now Brown's brigade is going to move through Clayton's, and they're going to press up and start pressing forward toward that same position that Clayton was going up against. Now, this is going to be a trademark of this focus and personal hands-on command. Brown's men are ordered up. The men began to press forward in what one of them called a cyclone of fire. And the engagement, George Dillon of the 18th Tennessee of Brown's Brigade notes the engagement was the most severe contest of any I ever witnessed in my life. They keep advancing. And then they start going over the ground where Clayton had been fighting. The dead and dying of both sides covered the ground, noted one. And another man remembered as they pushed on. The double quick was ordered, and then the charge. When our men raised the rebel yell, pressed on in fine order, we soon found ourselves on the ground that had just been occupied by the enemy. Pressing on again, we drove the enemy before us, inflicting terrible damage. The situation was so grave, the struggle so fierce, we did not look to right or left, but to the commands. Steady, forward, aim low, make every shot count. There were heard in the deadly conflict urging us all. And they're going to push the Union line back toward the Lafayette Road. And this is all going on in the woods just south of where the Brotherton Cabin is in the park, so if y'all know that area. And they're going to push that Union line onto the ridge beside the Brotherton Cabin. But then it's because they're going to start taking just such heavy losses. Colonel Palmer of the 18th Tennessee, waving his sword for the encouragement of his men, was struck by a ball that passed through his right shoulder, severing an artery. Command passed to Lieutenant Colonel Butler, William Butler, who had no more taken command than when he's wounded. And so you're seeing this repetition again. You got the colonel going down, then the lieutenant colonel, then the major, and finally, eventually ends up with Captain Gideon Lowe taking command of this regiment within just a short period of time. Beside them, the 26th Tennessee, from the counties just north of us here in East Tennessee, under the command of Colonel John M. Lillard. Lillard leads his men forward. Artillery shell explodes. Shrapnel strikes him in the chest, killing him. And so you just see this repeated again in all these regiments of Brown's brigade. So again, Stuart finally seeing that they've done their best, but not willing to push them beyond their point of endurance, is going to order them back. Then he's going to go to his ace card, William Bate. Now, William Bate, I told you a little bit about his brigade, is all these veterans who have, throughout the Army. A little interesting thing, though. One soldier of Bates' brigade, Sergeant Richard Gray of the 37th Georgia, wrote, "He had too little of the milk of human kindness in his composition to make an officer for whom the men would cheerfully sacrifice life and limb, because his management and ideas seemed to be that soldiers were machines to dance when he worked the wires. At Chickamauga, he knew as well as any, as much better, that a major general's baton lay in his success, and he would have sacrificed every member of the brigade to attain it. Fighting Billy shared the danger. Although he was willing to always throw his men into this thing and see every one of them dead if it meant his promotion, he was going to be right there with them. So they had a grudging respect for him. Although, as they said, he had too little of the milk of human kindness in him. So not that popular with the men, but they respect him. So now, though, Bates sees his chance when Stuart comes up to him, and he gives him the orders to go forward. Bates will ride over to to Colonel, this time, Thomas Benton Smith, the Colonel of the 20th Tennessee, young 20-something-year-old colonel from right just outside of Franklin, Tennessee. And he goes up to Smith and he tells him, now Smith, I want you to sail on those fellows like you were a wildcat." And this just seemed to simplify the whole brigade, because the men jump up and they began to rush forward, shouting, hollering, the rebel yell as they're moving forward through the woods, straight toward that position that Clayton had hammered, straight toward that position that Brown had hammered, and now they're pitching into it at full force. And it's like if you've ever taken a sledgehammer or a hammer to an old cinder block, and you hit that one spot once, you hit it twice, you hit it the third time, and it busts through. And indeed, that's kind of what's going to happen. That Yankee line had been pushed back out of the woods to the Lafayette Road. Then it pushed onto the ridge just outside of Brother the Cabin. And now here comes Smith's Wildcats, as Bates called them, sailing into that line. And what happens to the Union line at this point? It's like taking a rock and throwing it into a piece of glass. The Union line shatters apart. And Stuart's division busts through what is then the center of the Union line. A great opportunity has opened up for them at this point, and they will pour through the line. Bates' men pour through the line, but Bates' men are kind of like the kid in a candy store. There's Union troops running this way, and there's Union troops running this way. Which way do you go? Well, part of Bates' men will go after this bunch, part will go off toward this other group that's running to the north. Well, it just happens that as all this is going on, seeing that success was about to mount, Stuart then ordered Clayton's brigade, which had had time to rest, which had had time to get ammunition, to come back into action. So they're going to join part of Bates' brigade that are pushing to the west, while the bulk of Bates' brigade pushes to the north. And so we'll go with the group pushing to the north right now. They're going to drive Union troops in. They're going to burst into a field along the Lafayette Road known as Poe Field, just north of the Brotherton Cabin. It's where the Georgia State Monument is in the park today. And there on the north, they're going to see a field full of Union troops fleeing to the north toward a slight rise where they see a very daunting but very enticing sight. Along the northern end of Poe Field is a line of 24 Union cannons lined up side by side by side, but no infantry support. What did I tell you about Bate? How do you think Bate is going to react to this sight? He's going to order his men to charge. And it had to have been for the men one of those sights seeing that 300 yards north of them. They know they're not going to be able to get to those cannons before they open fire. But at the same time, without support, that line can be carried. But they've already been fighting Union troops, but now here they're going to be asked to do this. And of course, what does Bate do? He's out front on horse and he's yelling the men to charge. And the line charges forward. Along beside these cannons on the north end of the battlefield is a young Indiana lieutenant by the name of Ambrose Bierce. Anybody familiar with some of Bierce's writings, the old Twilight Zone episode, the occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge? He goes on to become a very macabre writer. In fact, Stephen King a number of years ago would cite that Ambrose Bierce was one of the writers who had inspired him. So it gives you an idea about how this guy is going to eventually write, but it's the sights that he sees during the war that really soured him about how good mankind really was. But he gives a vivid description of this assault. The field was gray with Confederates in pursuit. Then the guns opened fire with grape and canister, and for perhaps 5 minutes, it seemed an hour, nothing could be heard but the infernal din of their discharge. And nothing seemed through the smoke but a great accession of dust from the smitten soil. When all was over and the dust cloud had lifted, the spectacle was too dreadful to describe. The Confederates were still there, all of them it seemed, some almost under the muzzles of the guns, but not a man of these brave fellows was on his feet. And so thickly were that all covered with dust, and they looked as if they had been reclothed in yellow. "We bury our dead," said a gunner grimly. So just the idea, they charge forward and the artillery just tears them apart. Now, of course, he says it seemed all of them were there. Bates gets out, a good chunk of his men do as well, but they do suffer heavily in this. Bates' standard got the best of him. He wanted that promotion so bad, and that carrying that gun line would have done it. And so he ordered his men into a rather foolhardy charge. W.J. McMurray in the 20th Tennessee gives a Confederate perspective of that. Double charge after double charge of canister plowed through our ranks, and the only words to be heard above the roar of the battle were, "Close up and forward, men." The 20th carried into action 140 men and lost and killed 98, most of whom fell charging this battery. So Bate had basically overextended himself. Ultimately, his brigade lost 25% in this action from the beginning to end. But still, he broke the line. Now, Clayton's group and part of Bates' brigade that didn't charge into Poe Field are pushing on into the west, crossing through the Brotherton Field and into Dyer Field, coming out near where the leather tan yard was. But then they end up seeing a scene. Clayton sees off to the west a long line of Union troops rushing forward. Looking to the north, he sees a line of Union troops coming in from the north. Looks to the south, sees a force coming up from the south. They're kind of not wanting to repeat what Bate had done, and also not wanting to be a comment, doing a live action performance of Alfred Lord Tennyson's charge of the Light Brigade, cannons to the left of me, cannons to the right of me, cannons. He decides to withdraw. And then they march back Although Stewart had tore a gap in the center, his men had penetrated the center of the Union line because of the confused nature of the battle. Again, they're getting orders to go to the sound of the guns, to go, be governed by circumstances. He has no reinforcements coming forward to help him exploit this. So, this is one of those great could-have-beens of the Battle of Chickamauga. If they had had more men available to them, what could have happened at this point? Ironically, this is all going to happen at the same spot where the next day that Longstreet's assault will tear through the Union line. Yet it's a day before, several thousand more men who have not been killed yet were available at that time. So what might have happened had they had an opportunity to push themselves? So Stewart's actions here on the 19th will come to an end with this. Now, at the same time this is going on, Bushrod Johnson's division was still sitting down further to the south. And they're still holding that position, ready to brag, still loath to give up this idea of being able to smash into the flank down there. But all of a sudden, they get kind of an unexpected greeting. One soldier who's serving in Johnson's command noted, "The battle raged until 11 o'clock and the center moved forward. Soon the whole line was engaged. In less than 10 minutes, our regiment had lost 100 out of 168 men." They are just sitting around, waiting for nothing, when all of a sudden Union troops pop up with less than 100 yards in front of them, and they stir up a hornet's nest. Johnson's division charges forward, but Johnson does not keep as good a hold of things as Stewart does. And what ends up happening is one of his brigades smashes into Union troops, two of the brigades swing around, go forward, and basically he loses control of these three brigades, and they end up just fighting their own individual battles. One of them even coming up and being part of Stewart's line before it's all said and done. But the soldier goes on, he says, we charged them and put them to flight, but they rallied and drove us back. Again we charged, and again they were repulsed. So you get this seesaw back and forth nature of things. But with that ends the fighting on September 19th for both Bushrod Johnson and for A.P. Stewart. Now the next day, September 20th, will be the big day of action for the deciding day of the Battle of Chickamauga. And starts out again with Stewart and Johnson kind of not playing a big role in it. The big fighting is going to start on the north with Leonidas Polk attacking the Union troops around Kelly Field. But then things start to go wrong for Polk. Then Longstreet's wing, which these two divisions are part of, are going to be ordered into action. And Stewart's division is going to go in first, almost over the ground they had fought the day before in Poe Field. They'll charge forward, but be repulsed with losses again in that same area. So it had to be pretty haunting for these men to go charge and go to the ground where the dead and wounded from their own commands are still there from the day before, having been left out in the no man's land between the lines all night. But with their repulse, things are going to be kind of swapping roles now. Bushrod Johnson, who's not done too well the day before, and been involved in that seesaw fighting, but had no clear consequence. Now it's going to be their turn to be the ones that make a break in the Union line. Because a little after 11 a.m., Longstreet's wing of the Army charges forward toward a gap that had been opened in the Union line. The lead wave is going to be Bushrod Johnson and his brigades, his Tennesseans. And they're going to be the first ones to go through the center of the Union line, and they're going to tear the Union Army in half, just like Stewart had done the day before, but now with the full weight of Longstreet's whole half of the army behind them. Within a few minutes, a disaster of epic proportion falls upon the Union Army, with Bushrod Johnson's division leading the way. Indeed, Bushrod Johnson will write in his after-action report that the scene before him was one of unsurpassed grandeur, seeing the Union lines just melting away like ice on a warm morning. And with that, though, Stuart Johnson's men will drive the Union line off, that part of the Union line off the field. But still, part of the Union Army is going to cling on and fighting around Snodgrass Hill, and Johnson's division will be brought into action over there, launching several assaults against the Union left flank. While Stuart's division kind of sits out off in the woods off further to the west around the Kelly Field area. But then finally, in the last moments of the day of September 20th, both Stuart and Johnson are going to be called into action one last time simultaneously, although on opposite ends of the field. As the Union Army is beginning to withdraw, they get the orders to attack. Bushrod Johnson's men are going to storm up the slopes of Snodgrass Hill toward what is the Union right flank, and they're going to hit the Union line before it can withdraw, actually pushing the Union troops off the slopes of the hill, gaining the extreme right flank of the Union line. And if you go over there today, you're going to find some of the monuments and markers there. Indeed, one of the finest Confederate monuments on the Chickamauga battlefield is the regimental monument for Colonel Snowden's 25th Tennessee. Not many individual Confederate monuments on that field that are distinctive. Most all of them are carbon copies of each other. The 25th Tennessee has a very unique monument, and it stands on the ground that they took there in the final moments of the battle. While they're driving off the Union, taking that ground, and the Union troops are withdrawing, Stuart's going to launch a final attack against the Confederate or Union defenses around Kelly Field. The Union line had withstood all Pat Claiborne's attack, Breckinridge's attack, all states' rights gifts attacks earlier today. Well, now Stuart's men go forward, and they will hit the Union line just the worst possible moment for the Union troops. They're starting to get up to withdraw, and here comes Stuart's men tearing into them. And they turned what had been an orderly withdrawal into a panic, running. The sun is already set, and then this is a scene of just utter chaos in the dark, and Stuart's men will gobble up many prisoners there in the confusion and the darkness setting. So here you have it on both ends of the field, although an interesting story of contrasts. Bushrod Johnson had started as one of A.P. Stuart's subordinates, got his own division, then they both start the battle together, and now they're two of the last, firing the last shots of the battle together, although on opposite sides of the field. So kind of gives you a perspective of some of the troops and what the Battle of Chickamauga was like for a small group of men out of many of them, and many of them with origins here to the local area. Many of these Tennessee soldiers were from this area, and indeed A.P. Stuart enjoys a pretty prominent space down on the courthouse lawn with a bust down there today. So a very interesting dynamic character who played a very interesting role, and if not unheralded, seems semi-unheralded role in the Battle of Chickamauga and in the history of the Army of Tennessee. Well, folks, this is going to wrap this one up. I think I haven't gone over time, but if anybody has any questions, I'll be yes.
What did Stuart do after the war?
Well, Stuart does quite a bit of things. Ends up actually being a park commissioner for the Chickamauga battlefield, and living in this area for a number of years, and then ends up traveling after that all over in Florida and St. Louis and several other places. Anything else? Thank you all.